Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Part 6, Chapters 6 to 8. Chapter 6. Of the diverting and important scrutiny which the curate and the barber made in the library of our ingenious gentleman. He was still sleeping, so the curate asked the niece for the keys of the rooms where the books, the authors of all the mischief, were, and right willingly she gave them. They all went in, the housekeeper with them, and found more than 100 volumes of big books very well bound, and some other small ones. The moment the housekeeper saw them, she turned about and ran out of the room, and came back immediately with a saucer of holy water and a sprinkler, saying, "Here, your worship, Señor Licentiate, sprinkle this room. Don't leave any magician of the many there are in these books to bewitch us, in revenge for our design of banishing them from the world." The simplicity of the housekeeper made the licentiate laugh, and he directed the barber to give him the books one by one to see what they were about, as there might be some to be found among them that did not deserve the penalty of fire. "No," said the niece, "there is no reason for showing mercy to any of them. They have every one of them done mischief. Better fling them out of the window into the court, and make a pile of them, and set fire to them. Or else carry them into the yard, and there a bonfire can be made without the smoke giving any annoyance." The housekeeper said the same, so eager were they both for the slaughter of those innocents, but the curate would not agree to it without first reading, at any rate, the titles. The first that Master Nicholas put into his hand was the 4 books of Amadis of Gaul. "This seems a mysterious thing," says the curate, "for, as I have heard say, this was the first book of chivalry printed in Spain, and from this all the others derived their birth and origin. So it seems to me that we ought inexorably to condemn it to the flames as the founder of so vile a sect." "Nay, sir," said the barber, "I too have heard say that this is the best of all the books of this kind that have been written, and so as something singular in its line, it ought to be pardoned." "True," said the curate, "and for that reason let its life be spared for the present. Let us see that other which is next to it." "It is," said the barber, "the Sergas de Esplandian, the lawful son of Amadis of Gaul." "Then verily," said the curate, "the merit of the father must not be put down to the account of the son. Take it, mistress housekeeper, open the window and fling it into the yard, and lay the foundation of the pile of the bonfire we are to make." The housekeeper obeyed with great satisfaction, and the worthy Esplandian went flying into the yard to await with all patience the fire that was in store for him. "Proceed," said the curate. "This that comes next," said the barber, "is Amadis of Greece, and indeed I believe all those on this side are of the same Amadis lineage." "Then to the yard with the whole of them," said the curate, "for to have the burning of Queen Pintiquiniestra, and the shepherd Darniel, and his eclogues too, and the bedevilled and involved discourses of his author. I would burn with them the father who begot me, if he were going about in the guise of a knight-errant." "I am of the same mind," said the barber. "And so am I," added the niece. "In that case," said the housekeeper, "here, into the yard with them." They were handed to her, and as there were many of them, she spared herself the staircase, and flung them out of the window. "Who is that tub there?" said the curate. "This," said the barber, "is Don Olivante de Laura." "The author of that book," said the curate, "was the same that wrote the Garden of Flowers, and truly there is no deciding which of the two books is the more truthful, or, to put it better, the less lying. All I can say is, send this one into the yard for a swaggering fool. This that follows is Florismarte of Hircania, said the barber. Señor Florismarte here, said the curate, then by my faith he must take up his quarters in the yard, in spite of his marvellous birth and visionary adventures, for the stiffness and dryness of his style deserve nothing else. Into the yard with him and the other, mistress housekeeper. With all my heart, señor, said she, and executed the order with great delight. This, said the barber, is the Knight Plateer. An old book that, said the curate, but I find no reason for clemency in it. Send it after the others without appeal, which was done. Another book was opened, and they saw it was entitled The Knight of the Cross. For the sake of the holy name this book has, said the curate, its ignorance might be excused. But then, they say, behind the cross there's the devil. To the fire with it. Taking down another book, the barber said, This is the Mirror of Chivalry. I know, his worship, said the curate. That is where Señor Reinaldos of Montalban figures with his friends and comrades, greater thieves than Cacus and the 12 peers of France with the veracious historian Turpin. However, I am not for condemning them to more than perpetual banishment, because, at any rate, they have some share in the invention of the famous Matteo Boiardo, whence, too, the Christian poet Ludovico Ariosto wove his web, to whom, if I find him here, and speaking any language but his own, I shall show no respect whatever. But if he speaks his own tongue, I will put him upon my head. Well, I have him in Italian, said the barber, but I do not understand him. Nor would it be well that you should understand him, said the curate. And on that score, we might have excused the captain if he had not brought him into Spain and turned him into Castilian. He robbed him of a great deal of his natural force, and so do all those who try to turn books written in verse into another language. For with all the pains they take, and all the cleverness they show, they never can reach the level of the originals as they were first produced. In short, I say that this book, and all that may be found treating of those French affairs, should be thrown into or deposited in some dry well until, after more consideration, it is settled what is to be done with them, excepting always one Bernardo del Carpio that is going about, and another called Roncesvalles. For these, if they come into my hands, shall pass at once into those of the housekeeper, and from hers into the fire without any reprieve. To all this the barber gave assent, and looked upon it as right and proper, being persuaded that the curate was so staunch to the faith and loyal to the truth that he would not for the world say anything opposed to them. Opening another book, he saw it was Palmerin de Oliva, and beside it was another one called Palmerin of England, seeing which the licentiate said, Let the olive be made firewood of at once, and burned until no ashes even are left, and let that palm of England be kept and preserved as a thing that stands alone, and let such another case be made for it as that which Alexander found among the spoils of Darius, and set aside for the safekeeping of the works of the poet Homer. This book, gossip, is of authority for 2 reasons. First, because it is very good, and second, because it is said to have been written by a wise and witty king of Portugal. All the adventures of the castle of Miraguarda are excellent and of admirable contrivance, and the language is polished and clear, studying and observing the style befitting the speaker with propriety and judgment. So then, provided it seems good to you, Master Nicholas, I say, let this and Amadis of Gaul be remitted without the penalty of fire. And as for all the rest, let them perish without further question or query. Nay, gossip, said the barber, for this that I have here is the famous Don Bilianis. Well, said the curate, that and the second, third, and fourth parts of all stand in need of a little rhubarb to purge their excess of bile, and they must be cleared of all that stuff about the Castle of Fame and other greater affectations, to which end let them be allowed the overseas term, and according as they mend, so shall mercy or justice be meted out to them, and in the meantime, gossip, do you keep them in your house, and let no one read them. With all my heart, said the barber, and not caring to tire himself with reading more books of chivalry, he told the housekeeper to take all the big ones and throw them into the yard. It was not said to one dull or deaf, but to one who enjoyed burning them more than weaving the broadest and finest web that could be, and seizing about 8 at a time, she flung them out of the window. In carrying so many together, she let one fall at the feet of the barber, who took it up, curious to know what it was, and found it said, History of the famous knight Tirante el Blanco. God bless me, said the curate, Tirante el Blanco here? Hand it over, gossip, for in it I reckon I have found a treasury of enjoyment and a mine of recreation. Here is Don Quixote Miguel of Montalvan, a valiant knight, and his brother Thomas of Montalvan, and the knight Fonseca, with the battle the bold Tirante fought with the mastiff, and the witticisms of the damsel Placer de mi vida, and the loves and wiles of the widow Reposada, and the empress in love with the squire Ippolito. In truth, gossip, by right of its style, it is the best book in the world. Here knights eat and sleep, and die in their beds, and make their wills before dying, and a great deal of more of which there are not in the other books. Nevertheless, I say, he who wrote it, for deliberately composing such fooleries, deserves to be sent to the galleys for life. Take it home with you and read it, and you will see that what I have said is true. As you will, said the barber, but what are we to do with these little books that are left? They must be, not chivalry, but poetry, said the curate, and opening up one he saw it was the Diana of Jorge de Montemayor, and supposing all the others to be of the same sort, he said, These do not deserve to be burned like the others, for they neither do nor can do the mischief the books of chivalry have done, being books of entertainment that can hurt no one. Ah, señor, said the niece, your worship had better order these to be burned as well as the others, for it would be no wonder if, after being cured of his chivalry disorder, my uncle, by reading these, took a fancy to turn shepherd and range the woods and fields singing and piping, or what would be still worse, to turn poet, which they say is an incurable and infectious malady. The damsel is right, said the curate, and it will be well to put this stumbling block and temptation out of our friend's way. To begin, then, with the Diana of Montemayor, I am of the opinion it should not be burned, but that it should be cleared of all that about the sage Felicia, and the magic water, and of almost all the longer pieces of verse. Let it keep and welcome its prose, and the honour of being the first of books of the kind. "This that comes next," said the barber, "is the Diana, entitled The Second Part, by the Salamancan, and this other has the same title, and its author is Gil Polo." "As for the Salamancan," replied the curate, "let it go to swell the number of the condemned in the yard, and let Gil Polos be preserved, as if it came from Apollo himself. But get on, gossip, and make haste, for it is growing late." "This book," said the barber, opening another, "is the 10 books of the Fortune of Love, written by Antonio de Lofraso, a Sardinian poet." "By the orders I have received," said the curate, "since Apollo has been Apollo, and the Muses have been Muses, and poets have been poets, so droll and absurd a book as this has never been written, and in its way it is the best and the most singular of all of this species that have as yet appeared, and he who has not read it may be sure that he has never read what is delightful. Give it here, gossip, for I make more account of having found it than if they had given me a cassock of Florence stuff." He put it aside with extreme satisfaction, and the barber went on. "These that come next are the Shepherd of Iberia, Nymphs of Henares, and the Enlightenment of Jealousy." "Then all we have to do," said the curate, "is to hand them over to the secular arm of the housekeeper, and ask me not why, or we shall never have done. The next is the Pastor of Philida." "No pastor that," said the curate, "but a highly polished courtier. Let it be preserved as a precious jewel." "This large one here," said the barber, "is called the Treasury of Poems." "If there were not so many of them," said the curate, "they would be more relished. This book must be weeded and cleansed of certain vulgarities, which it has with its excellences. Let it be preserved, because the author is a friend of mine, and out of respect for other more heroic and loftier works that he has written." "This," continued the barber, "is the Cancionero of Lopez de Maldonado." "The author of that book, too," said the curate, "is a great friend of mine, and his verses, from his own mouth, are the admiration of all who hear them, for such is the sweetness of his voice that he enchants when he chants them. It gives rather too much of its eclogues, but what is good was never yet plentiful. Let it be kept with those that have been set apart. But what book is next with it?" "The Galatea of Miguel de Cervantes," said the barber. "That Cervantes has been for many years a great friend of mine, and to my knowledge he has had more experience in reverses than in verses. His book has some good invention in it. It presents us with something, but brings nothing to a conclusion. We must wait for the second part, it promises. Perhaps with amendment it may succeed in winning the full measure of grace that is now denied it, and in the meantime do you, Señor Gossip, keep it shut in your own quarters." "Very good," said the barber, "and here come another 3 together. The Araucana of Don Alonso de Ercilla, the Austriada of Juan Rufo, Justice of Cordova, and the Montserrate of Cristobal de Virues, the Valencian poet." "These 3 books," said the curate, "are the best that have been written in Castilian in heroic verse, and they may compare with the most famous of Italy. Let them be preserved, as the richest treasures of poetry that Spain possesses." The curate was tired and would not look into any more books, and so he decided that, contents uncertified, all the rest should be burned. But just then the barber held open one called The Tears of Angelica. "Oh, I should have shed tears myself," said the curate when he heard the title, "had I ordered that book to be burned, for its author was one of the famous poets of the world, not to say of Spain, and was very happy in the translation of some of Ovid's fables. Chapter 7. Of the second sally of our worthy knight Don Quixote of La Mancha. At this instant Don Quixote began shouting out, "Hear, hear, valiant knights! Here is need for you to put forth the might of your strong arms, for they of the court are gaining the mastery in the tourney." Called away by this noise and outcry, they proceeded no farther with the scrutiny of the remaining books, and so it is thought that the Carolea, the Lion of Spain, and the Deeds of the Emperor, written by Don Luis de Avila, went to the fire unseen and unheard, for, no doubt, they were among those that remained, and perhaps if the curate had seen them, they would not have undergone so severe a sentence. When they reached Don Quixote, he was already out of bed, and was still shouting and raving and slashing and cutting all around, as wide awake as if he had never slept. They closed with him, and by force got him back into the bed, and when he had become a little calm, addressing the curate, he said to him, "Of a truth, Señor Archbishop Turpin, it is a great disgrace for us who call ourselves the 12 Peers, so carelessly to allow the knights of the court to gain the victory in this tourney, we, the adventurers, having carried off the honour on the 3 former days." "Hush, gossip," said the curate. "Please God, the luck may turn, and what is lost today may be won tomorrow. For the present let your worship have a care to your health, for it seems to me that you are over-fatigued, if not badly wounded." "Wounded? No," said Don Quixote, "but bruised and battered, no doubt, for that bastard Don Roland has cudgelled me with the trunk of an oak tree, and all for envy, because he sees that I alone rival him in his achievements. But I should not call myself Reinaldos of Montalvan did he not pay me for it, in spite of all his enchantments, as soon as I rise from this bed. For the present, let them bring me something to eat, for that, I feel, is what will be more to my purpose, and leave it to me to avenge myself." They did as he wished. They gave him something to eat, and once more he fell asleep, leaving them marvelling at his madness. That night the housekeeper burned to ashes all the books that were in the yard and in the whole house, and some must have been consumed that deserved preservation in everlasting archives, but their fate and the laziness of the examiner did not permit it, and so in them was verified the proverb that the innocent suffer for the guilty. One of the remedies which the curate and the barber immediately applied to their friend's disorder was to wall up and plaster the room where the books were, so that when he got up he should not find them. Possibly the cause being removed, the effect might cease, and they might say that a magician had carried them off, room and all. And this was done with all dispatch. 2 days later Don Quixote got up, and the first thing he did was to go and look for his books, and not finding the room where he had left it, he wandered from side to side looking for it. He came to the place where the door used to be, and tried it with his hands, and turned and twisted his eyes in every direction without saying a word. But after a good while he asked his housekeeper whereabouts was the room that held his books. The housekeeper, who had been already well instructed in what she was to answer, said, "What room or what nothing is it that your worship is looking for? There are neither room nor books in this house now, for the devil has carried all away." "It was not the devil," said the niece, "but a magician who came on a cloud one night, after the day your worship left us, and dismounting from a serpent that he rode, he entered the room, and what he did there I know not, but after a little while he made off, flying through the roof, and left the house full of smoke, and when we went to see what he had done, we saw neither book nor room, but we remember very well, the housekeeper and I, that on leaving The old villain said in a loud voice that, for a private grudge he owed the owner of the books in the room, he had done mischief in that house that would be discovered by and by. He said, too, that his name was the Sage Munaton. He must have said Friston, said Don Quixote. I don't know whether he called himself Friston or Friton, said the housekeeper. I only know that his name ended with ton. So it does, said Don Quixote, and he is a sage magician, a great enemy of mine, who has a spite against me because he knows by his arts and lore that in process of time I am to engage in single combat with a knight whom he befriends, and that I am to conquer, and he will be unable to prevent it, and for this reason he endeavours to do me all the ill turns that he can. But I promise him it will be hard for him to oppose or avoid what is decreed by heaven. Who doubts that? Said the niece. But, uncle, who mixes you up in these quarrels? Would it not be better to remain at peace in your own house, instead of roaming the world looking for better bread than ever came of wheat, never reflecting that many go for wool and come back shorn? Oh, niece of mine, replied Don Quixote, how much astray art thou in thy reckoning! Ere they shear me, I shall have plucked away and stripped off the beards of all who dare to touch only the tip of a hair of mine. The two were unwilling to make any further answer, as they saw that his anger was kindling. In short, then, he remained at home 15 days, very quietly, without showing any signs of a desire to take up with his former delusions, and during this time he held lively discussions with his two gossips, the curate and the barber, on the point he maintained, that knights-errant were what the world stood most in need of, and that in him was to be accomplished the revival of knight-errantry. The curate sometimes contradicted him, sometimes agreed with him, for if he had not observed this precaution, he would have been unable to bring him to reason. Meanwhile, Don Quixote worked upon a farm labourer, a neighbour of his, an honest man, if indeed that title can be given to him who is poor, but with very little wit in his pate. In a word, he so talked him over, and with such persuasions and promises, that the poor clown made up his mind to sally forth with him and serve him as esquire. Don Quixote, among other things, told him he ought to be ready to go with him gladly, because any moment an adventure might occur that might win an island in the twinkling of an eye and leave him governor of it. On these and like promises, Sancho Panza, for so the labourer was called, left wife and children, and engaged himself as esquire to his neighbour. Don Quixote next set about getting some money, and selling one thing and pawning another, and making a bad bargain in every case, he got together a fair sum. He provided himself with a buckler, which he begged as a loan from a friend, and, restoring his battered helmet as best he could, he warned his squire Sancho of the day and hour he meant to set out, that he might provide himself with what he thought most needful. Above all, he charged him to take alforjas with him. The other said he would, and that he meant to take also a very good ass he had, as he was not much given to going on foot. About the ass, Don Quixote hesitated a little, trying whether he could call to mind any knight-errant taking with him an esquire mounted on ass-back, but no instance occurred to his memory. For all that, however, he determined to take him, intending to furnish him with a more honourable mount when a chance of it presented itself, by appropriating the horse of the first discourteous knight he encountered. Himself he provided with shirts and such other things as he could, according to the advice the host had given him. All which being done, without taking leave, Sancho Panza of his wife and children, or Don Quixote of his housekeeper and niece, they sallied forth, unseen by anybody, from the village one night, and made such good way in the course of it that by daylight they held themselves safe from discovery, even should search be made for them. Sancho rode on his ass like a patriarch, with his alforjas and bota, and longing to see himself soon governor of the island his master had promised him. Don Quixote decided upon taking the same route and road he had taken on his first journey, that over the Campo de Montiel, which he travelled with less discomfort than on the last occasion, for, as it was early morning and the rays of the sun fell on them obliquely, the heat did not distress them. "And now," said Sancho Panza to his master, "your worship will take care, Señor Knight-errant, not to forget about the island you promised me, for be it ever so big, I'll be equal to governing it." To which Don Quixote replied, "Thou must know, friend Sancho Panza, that it was a practice very much in vogue with the knights-errant of old to make their squires governors of the islands or kingdoms they won, and I am determined that there shall be no failure on my part in so liberal a custom. On the contrary, I mean to improve upon it, for they sometimes, and perhaps most frequently, waited until their squires were old, and then, when they had enough of their service and hard days and worse nights, they gave them some title or other of count, or at the most marquis, of some valley or province, more or less. But if thou livest, and I live, it may well be that before 6 days are over I may have won some kingdom that has others dependent upon it, which will be just the thing to enable thee to be crowned king of one of them. Nor needst thou count this wonderful, for things and chances fall to the lot of such knights in ways so unexampled and unexpected that I might easily give thee even more than I promised thee." "In that case," said Sancho Panza, "if I should become a king by one of those miracles your worship speaks of, even Juana Gutierrez, my old woman, would come to be queen, and my children infantes." "Well, who doubts it?" said Don Quixote. "I doubt it," replied Sancho Panza, "because for my part I am persuaded that though God should shower down kingdoms upon earth, not one of them would fit the head of Mari Gutierrez. Let me tell you, señor, she is not worth 2 maravedis for a queen. Countess will fit her better, and that only with God's help." "Leave it to God, Sancho," returned Don Quixote, "for he will give her what suits her best. But do not undervalue thyself so much as to come to be content with anything less than being governor of a province." "I will not, señor," answered Sancho, "specially as I have a man of such quality for a master in your worship, who will know how to give me all that will be suitable for me, and that I can bear." Chapter 8. Of the good fortune which the valiant Don Quixote had in the terrible and undreamt of adventure of the windmills, with other occurrences worthy to be fitly recorded. At this point they came in sight of 30 or 40 windmills that there are on plain, and as soon as Don Quixote saw them, he said to his squire, "Fortune is arranging matters for us better than we could have shaped our desires ourselves. For look here, friend Sancho Panza, where 30 or more monstrous giants present themselves, all of which I mean to engage in battle and slay, and with whose spoils we shall begin to make our fortunes. For this is the righteous warfare, and it is God's service to sweep so evil a breed from the face of the earth." "What giants?" said Sancho Panza. "Those thou seest there," answered his master, "with the long arms, and some have them nearly 2 leagues long." "Look, your worship," said Sancho, "what we see there are not giants, but windmills, and what seem to be their arms are the sails that, turned by the wind, make the millstones go." "It is easy to see," replied Don Quixote, "that thou art not used to this business of adventure. Those are giants, and if thou art afraid, away with thee out of this, and betake thyself to prayer, while I engage them in fierce and unequal combat." So saying, he gave the spur to his steed Rocinante. Heedless of the cries of his squire, Sancho sent after him, warning him that most certainly they were windmills and not giants he was going to attack. He, however, was so positive that they were giants that he neither heard the cries of Sancho nor perceived, near as he was, what they were, but made at them, shouting, "Fly not, cowards and vile beings, for a single knight attacks you." A slight breeze at this moment sprang up, and the great sails began to move, seeing which Don Quixote exclaimed, "Though ye flourish more arms than the giant Briareus, ye have to reckon with me." So saying, and committing himself with all his heart to his lady Dulcinea, imploring her to support him in such a peril, with lance in rest, and covered by his buckler, he charged at Rocinante's fullest gallop, and fell upon the first mill that stood in front of him. But as he drove his lance point into the sail, the wind whirled it round with such force that it shivered the lance to pieces, sweeping with it horse and rider, who went rolling over on the plain, in a sorry condition. Sancho hastened to his assistance as fast as his ass could go, and when he came up found him unable to move, with such a shock had Rocinante fallen with him. "God bless me," said Sancho, "did I not tell your worship to mind what you were about, for they were only windmills, and no one could have made any mistake about it but one who had something of the same kind in his head." "Hush, friend Sancho," replied Don Quixote. "The fortunes of war, more than any other, are liable to frequent fluctuations, and moreover I think, and it is the truth, that same sage Friston, who carried off my study and books, has turned these giants into mills in order to rob me of the glory of vanquishing them. Such is the enmity he bears toward me, but in the end his wicked arts will avail but little against my good sword." "God order it as he may," said Sancho Panza, and helping him to rise, got him up again on Rocinante, whose shoulder was half out, and then, discussing the late adventure, they followed the road to Puerto Lapice, for there, said Don Quixote, they could not fail to find adventures in abundance and variety, as it was a great thoroughfare. For all that, he was much grieved at the loss of his lance, and saying so to his squire, he added, "I remember having read how a Spanish knight, Diego Perez de Vargas by name, having broken his sword in battle, tore from an oak a ponderous branch or bough, and with it did such things that day, and pounded so many Moors, that he got the surname of Machuca, and he and his descendants from that day forth were called Vargas y Machuca. I mention this because from the first oak I see I mean to rend such another branch, large and stout like that, with which I am determined and resolved to such deeds that thou mayst deem thyself very fortunate in being found worthy to come and see them, and be an eyewitness of things that will with difficulty be believed." "Be that as it will," said Sancho, "I believe it is all as your worship says it, but straighten yourself a little, for you seem all on one side, maybe from the shaking in the fall." "That is the truth," said Don Quixote, "and if I make no complaint of the pain, it is because knight-errants are not permitted to complain of any wound, even though their bowels be coming out through it." "If so," said Sancho, "I have nothing to say, but God knows I would rather your worship complained when anything ailed you. For my part, I confess I must complain, however small the ache may be, unless this rule about not complaining extends to the squires of knight-errants also. Don Quixote could not help laughing at his squire's simplicity, and he assured him he might complain whenever and however he chose, just as he liked, for so far he had never read of anything to the contrary in the order of knighthood. Sancho bade him remember it was dinner time, to which his master answered that he wanted nothing himself just then, but that he might eat when he had a mind. With this permission, Sancho settled himself as comfortably as he could on his beast, and taking out of the alforjas what he had stowed away in them, he jogged along behind his master, munching deliberately, and from time to time taking a pull at the bota, with a relish that the thirstiest tapster in Malaga might have envied. And while he went on in this way, gulping down draught after draught, he never gave a thought to any of the promises his master had made him, nor did he rate it as hardship, but rather as recreation, going in quest of adventures, however dangerous they might be. Finally, they passed the night among some trees, from one of which Don Quixote plucked a dry branch to serve him after a fashion as a lance, and fixed on it the head he had removed from the broken one. All that night Don Quixote lay awake thinking of his lady Dulcinea, in order to conform to what he had read in his books. How many nights in the forest and deserts knights used to lie sleepless, supported by the memory of their mistresses. Not so did Sancho Panza spend it, for having a stomach full of something stronger than chicory water, he made but one sleep of it, and if his master had not called him, neither the rays of the sun beating on his face, nor all the cheery notes of the birds welcoming the approach of day, would have had power to waken him. On getting up, he tried the bota, and found it somewhat less full than the night before, which grieved his heart, because they did not seem to be on the way to remedy the deficiency readily. Don Quixote did not care to break his fast, for, as has been already said, he confined himself to savoury recollections for nourishment. They returned to the road that they had set out with, leading to Puerto Lapice, and at 3 in the afternoon they came in sight of it. "Here, brother Sancho Panza," said Don Quixote when he saw it, "we may plunge our hands up to the elbows in what they call adventures. But observe, even shouldst thou see me in the greatest danger in the world, thou must not put a hand to thy sword in my defence, unless indeed thou perceivest that those who assail me are rabble or base folk, for in that case thou mayst very properly aid me. But if they be knights, it is on no account permitted or allowed thee by the laws of knighthood to help me until thou hast been dubbed a knight." "Most certainly, señor," replied Sancho. "Your worship shall be fully obeyed in this matter, all the more as of myself I am peaceful and no friend to mixing in strife and quarrels. It is true that, as regards the defence of my own person, I shall not give much heed to those laws, for laws human and divine allow each one to defend himself against any assailant whatever." "That I grant," said Don Quixote, "but in this matter of aiding me against knights, thou must put a restraint upon thy natural impetuosity." "I will do so, I promise you," answered Sancho, "and will keep this precept as carefully as Sunday." While they were thus talking, there appeared on the road 2 friars of the order of Saint Benedict, mounted on 2 dromedaries, for not less tall were the 2 mules they rode on. They wore travelling spectacles and carried sunshades, and behind them came a coach attended by 4 or 5 persons on horseback and 2 muleteers on foot. In the coach there was, as afterwards appeared, a Biscay lady on her way to Seville, where her husband was about to take passage for the Indies with an appointment of high honour. The friars, though going the same road, were not in her company, but the moment Don Quixote perceived them, he said to his squire, "Either I am mistaken, or this is going to be the most famous adventure that has ever been seen, for those black bodies we see there must be, and doubtless are, magicians who are carrying off some stolen princess in that coach, and with all my might I must undo this wrong." "This will be worse than the windmills," said Sancho. "Look, señor, those are friars of Saint Benedict, and the coach plainly belongs to some travellers. I tell you, mind well what you are about, and don't let the devil mislead you." "I have told thee already, Sancho," replied Don Quixote, "that on the subject of adventures thou knowest little. What I say is the truth, as thou shalt presently see." So saying, he advanced and posted himself in the middle of the road along which the friars were coming, and as soon as he thought they had come near enough to hear what he said, he cried aloud, "Devilish and unnatural beings, release instantly the high-born princesses whom you are carrying off by force in this coach, else prepare to meet a speedy death as the just punishment of your evil deeds." The friars drew rein and stood wondering at the appearance of Don Quixote, as well as at his words, to which they replied, "Señor Caballero, we are not devilish or unnatural, but two brothers of Saint Benedict following our road, nor do we know whether or not there are any captive princesses coming in this coach." "No soft words with me, for I know you, lying rabble," said Don Quixote, and without waiting for a reply, he spurred Rocinante, and with levelled lance charged the first friar with such fury and determination that if the friar had not flung himself off the mule, he would have brought him to the ground against his will, and sore wounded, if not killed him outright. The second brother, seeing how his comrade was treated, drove his heels into his castle of a mule, and made off across the country faster than the wind. Sancho Panza, when he saw the friar on the ground, dismounting briskly from his ass, rushed towards him and began to strip off his gown. At that instant the friar's muleteers came up and asked what he was stripping him for. Sancho answered them that this fell to him lawfully as spoil of the battle which his lord Don Quixote had won. The muleteers, who had no idea of a joke and did not understand all this about battles and spoils, seeing that Don Quixote was some distance off talking to the travellers in the coach, fell upon Sancho, knocked him down, and leaving hardly a hair in his beard, belaboured him with kicks, and left him stretched breathless and senseless on the ground, and without any more delay helped the friar to mount, who, trembling, terrified, and pale, as soon as he found himself in the saddle, spurred after his companion, who was standing at a distance, looking on, watching the result of the onslaught. Then, not caring to wait for the end of the affair just begun, they pursued their journey, making more crosses than if they had the devil after them. Don Quixote was, as has been said, speaking to the lady in the coach. "Your beauty, lady mine," said he, "may now dispose of your person as may be most in accordance with your pleasure, for the pride of your ravishers lies prostrate on the ground through this strong arm of mine, and lest you should be pining to know the name of your deliverer, know that I am called Don Quixote of La Mancha, knight-errant and adventurer, and captive to the peerless and beautiful lady Dulcinea del Toboso, and in return for the service you have received of me, I ask no more than that you should return to El Toboso, and on my behalf present yourself before that lady, and tell her what I have done to set you free." One of the squires in attendance upon the coach, a Biscayan, was listening to all Don Quixote was saying, and perceiving that he would not allow the coach to go on, but was saying it must return at once to El Toboso, he made at him, and seizing his lance, addressed him in bad Castilian and worse Biscayan, after his fashion. Begone, caballero, and ill go with thee, by the God that made thee, unless thou quittest coach, slayest thee as art here a Biscayan. Don Quixote understood him quite well, and answered him very quietly, If thou wert a knight, and as thou art none, I should have already chastised thy folly and rashness, miserable creature. To which the Biscayan returned, I am no gentleman. I swear to God thou liest, as I am a Christian. If thou droppest lance and drawest sword, soon shalt thou see thou art carrying water to the cat. Biscayan on land, hidalgo at sea, hidalgo at the devil. And look, if thou sayest otherwise, thou liest. You will see presently, said Aguares, replied Don Quixote, and throwing his lance on the ground, he drew his sword, braced his buckler on his arm, and attacked the Biscayan, bent upon taking his life. The Biscayan, when he saw him coming on, though he wished to dismount from his mule, in which, being one of those sorry ones let out for hire, he had no confidence, had no choice but to draw his sword. It was lucky for him, however, that he was near the coach, from which he was able to snatch a cushion that served him for a shield, and they went at one another as if they had been two mortal enemies. The others strove to make peace between them, but could not, for the Biscayan declared in his disjointed phrases that if they did not let him finish his battle, he would kill his mistress and everyone that strove to prevent him. The lady in the coach, amazed and terrified at what she saw, ordered the coachman to draw aside a little, and set herself to watch this severe struggle, in the course of which the Biscayan smote Don Quixote a mighty stroke on the shoulder over the top of his buckler, which, given to one without armour, would have cleft him to the waist. Don Quixote, feeling the weight of this prodigious blow, cried aloud, saying, O lady of my soul, Dulcinea, flower of beauty, come to the aid of this your knight, who, in fulfilling his obligations to your beauty, finds himself in this extreme peril. To say this, to lift his sword, to shelter himself well behind his buckler, and to assail the Biscayan was the work of an instant, determined as he was to venture all upon a single blow. The Biscayan, seeing him come on in this way, was convinced of his courage by his spirited bearing, and resolved to follow his example, so he waited for him, keeping well under cover of his cushion, being unable to execute any sort of manoeuvre with his mule, which, dead tired, and never meant for this kind of game, could not stir a step. On then, as aforesaid, came Don Quixote against the wary Biscayan, with uplifted sword and a firm intention of splitting him in half, and while on his side the Biscayan waited for him, sword in hand, and under the protection of his cushion, and all present stood trembling, waiting in the suspense the result of blows such as threatened to fall, and the lady in the coach and the rest of her following were making 1,000 vows and offerings to all the images and shrines of Spain, that God might deliver her squire, and all of them, from this great peril in which they found themselves. But it spoils all, that at this point and crisis the author of the history leaves this battle impending, giving as excuse that he could find nothing more written about those achievements of Don Quixote than what has been already set forth. It is true, the second author of this work was unwilling to believe that a history so curious could have been allowed to fall under the sentence of oblivion, or that the wits of La Mancha could have been so undiscerning as not to preserve in their archives or registries some documents referring to this famous knight, and this being his persuasion, he did not despair of finding the conclusion of this pleasant history, which, heaven favoring him, he did find in a way that shall be related in the second part. End of Part 6.
Don Quixote, Volume 1, by Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra. Translated by John Ormsby. Part 4, Chapters 9 through 13. Chapter 9, in which is concluded and finished the terrific battle between the gallant Biscayan and the valiant Manchegan. In the first part of this history we left the valiant Biscayan and the renowned Don Quixote with drawn swords uplifted, ready to deliver two such furious slashing blows that if they had fallen full and fair, they would at least have split, and cleft them asunder from top to toe, and laid them open like a pomegranate. And at this so critical point, the delightful history came to a stop, and stood cut short without any intimation from the author where what was missing was to be found. This distressed me greatly, because the pleasure derived from having read such a small portion turned to vexation at the thought of the poor chance that presented itself of finding the large part that, so it seemed to me, was missing of such an interesting tale. It appeared to me to be a thing impossible and contrary to all precedent that so good a knight should have been without some sage to undertake the task of writing his marvellous achievements, a thing that was never wanting to any of those knights-errant who, they say, went after adventures. For every one of them had one or two sages as if made on purpose, who not only recorded their deeds, but described their most trifling thoughts and follies, however secret they might be, and such a good knight could not have been so unfortunate as not to have what Platir and others like him had in abundance. And so I could not bring myself to believe that such a gallant tale had been left maimed and mutilated, and I laid the blame on time, the devourer and destroyer of all things, that had either concealed or consumed it. On the other hand, it struck me that, inasmuch as among his books there had been found such modern ones as The Enlightenment of Jealousy and The Nymphs and Shepherds of Henares, his story must likewise be modern, and that though it might not be written, it might exist in the memory of the people of his village and of those in the neighbourhood. This reflection kept me perplexed, and longing to know really and truly the whole life and wondrous deeds of our famous Spaniard, Don Quixote of La Mancha, light and mirror of Manchegan chivalry, and the first that in our age and in these so evil days devoted himself to the labour and exercise of the arms of knight-errantry, righting wrongs, succouring widows, and protecting damsels of that sort that used to ride about, whip in hand, on their palfreys, with all their virginity about them, from mountain to mountain and valley to valley. For if it were not some ruffian, or boor with a hood and hatchet, or monstrous giant that forced them, there were in days of yore damsels that at the end of 80 years, in all which time they had never slept a day under a roof, went to their graves as much maids as the mothers that bore them. I say then that in these and other respects our gallant Don Quixote is worthy of everlasting and notable praise, nor should it be withheld even from me for the labour and pains spent in searching for the conclusion of this delightful history, though I know well that if heaven, chance, and good fortune had not helped me, the world would have remained deprived of an entertainment and pleasure that for a couple of hours or so may well occupy him who shall read it attentively. The discovery of it occurred in this way. One day, as I was in the Alcana of Toledo, a boy came up to sell some pamphlets and old papers to a silk mercer, and as I am fond of reading even the very scraps of paper in the streets, led by this natural bent of mine, I took up one of the pamphlets the boy had for sale, and saw that it was in characters which I recognized as Arabic, and as I was unable to read them, though I could recognize them, I looked about to see if there were any Spanish-speaking Morisco at hand to read them for me, nor was there any great difficulty in finding such an interpreter, for even had I sought one for an older and better language, I should have found him. In short, chance provided me with one, who, when I told him what I wanted and put the book in his hands, opened it in the middle, and after reading a little in it, began to laugh. I asked him what he was laughing at, and he replied that it was something the book had written in the margin by way of a note. I bade him tell it to me, and he, still laughing, said, "In the margin, as I told you, this is written: This Dulcinea de Toboso, so often mentioned in this history, had, they say, the best hand of any woman in all of La Mancha for salting pigs." When I heard Dulcinea de Toboso named, I was struck with surprise and amazement, for it occurred to me at once that these pamphlets contained the history of Don Quixote. With this idea I pressed him to read the beginning, and doing so, turning the Arabic offhand into Castilian, he told me it meant, "History of Don Quixote of La Mancha, written by Cide Hamete Ben Engeli, an Arab historian." It required great caution to hide the joy I felt when the title of the book reached my ears, and snatching it from the silk mercer, I bought all the papers and pamphlets from the boy for half a real. And if he had had his wits about him, and had known how eager I was for them, he might safely have calculated on making more than 6 reals by the bargain. I withdrew at once with the Morisco into the cloister of the cathedral, and begged him to turn all these pamphlets that related to Don Quixote into the Castilian tongue, without omitting or adding anything to them, offering him whatever payment he pleased. He was satisfied with 2 arrobas of raisins and 2 bushels of wheat, and promised to translate them faithfully and with all dispatch. But to make the matter easier, and not to let such a precious find out of my hands, I took him to my house, where in little more than a month and a half he translated the whole just as it is set down here. In the first pamphlet, the battle between Don Quixote and the Biscayan was drawn to the very life. They planted in the same attitude as the history describes, their swords raised, and the one protected by his buckler, the other by his cushion, and the Biscayan's mule so true to nature that it could be seen to be a hired one, a bow shot off. The Biscayan had an inscription under his feet which said, Don Sancho de Azpeitia, which no doubt must have been his name, and at the feet of Rocinante was another that said, Don Quixote. Rocinante was marvellously portrayed, so long and thin, so lank and lean, with so much backbone, and so far gone in consumption, that he had showed plainly with what judgment and propriety the name of Rocinante had been bestowed upon him. Near him was Sancho Panza, holding the halter of his ass, at whose feet was another label that said, Sancho Zancas, and according to the picture he must have had a big belly, a short body, and long shanks, for which reason, no doubt, the names of Pancha and Zancas were given to him, for by these 2 surnames the history several times calls him. Some other trifling particulars might be mentioned, but they are all of slight importance, and have nothing to do with the true relation of the history, and no history can be bad, so long as it is true. If against the present one any objection be raised on the score of its truth, it can only be that its author was an Arab, as lying is a very common propensity with those of that nation, though as they are such enemies of ours, it is conceivable that there were omissions rather than additions made in the course of it. And this is my own opinion, for where he could and should give freedom to his pen in praise of so worthy a knight, he seems to me deliberately to pass it over in silence, which is ill done, and worse contrived, for it is the business and duty of historians to be exact, truthful, and wholly free from passion, and neither interest nor fear, hatred nor love, should make them swerve from the path of truth, whose mother is history, rival of time, storehouse of deeds, witness for the past, example and counsel for the present, and warning for the future. In this I know will be found all that can be desired in the pleasantest, and if it be wanting in any good quality, I maintain it is the fault of its hound of an author, and not the fault of the subject. To be brief, its second part, according to the translation, began in this way. With trenchant swords upraised and poised on high, it seemed as though the 2 valiant and wrathful combatants stood threatening heaven and earth and hell, with such resolution and determination did they bear themselves. The fiery Biscayan was the first to strike a blow, which was delivered with such force and fury that had not the sword turned in its course, that single stroke would have sufficed to put an end to the bitter struggle and to all the adventures of our knight. But that good fortune which reserved him for greater things turned aside the sword of his adversary, so that although it smote him upon the left shoulder, it did him no more harm than to strip all that side of its armour, carrying away a great part of his helmet with half his ear, all which with fearful ruin fell to the ground, leaving him in a sorry plight. Good God, who is there that could properly describe the rage that filled the heart of our Manchegan when he saw himself dealt with in this fashion? All that can be said is, it was such that he again raised himself in his stirrups, and grasping his sword more firmly with both hands, he came down upon the Biscayan with such fury, smiting him full over the cushion and over the head, that even so good a shield proving useless, as if a mountain had fallen on him, he began to bleed from his nose, mouth, and ears, reeling as if about to fall backwards from his mule, as no doubt he would have done, had he not flung his arms about its neck. At the same time, however, he slipped his feet out of the stirrups and unclasped his arms, and the mule, taking fright at the terrible blow, made off across the plain, and with a few plunges flung its master to the ground. Don Quixote stood looking on very calmly, and when he saw him fall, leaped from his horse, and with great briskness ran to him, and presenting the point of his sword to his eyes, bade him surrender, or he would cut his head off. The Biscayan was so bewildered that he was unable to answer a word, and it would have gone hard with him, so blind was Don Quixote, had not the ladies in the coach, who had hitherto been watching with earnest entreaties to grant them the great grace and favour of sparing their squire's life, to which Don Quixote replied with much gravity and dignity, "In truth, fair ladies, I am well content to do what you ask of me, but it must be on one condition and understanding, which is, that this knight promise me to go to the village of El Toboso, and on my behalf present himself to the peerless lady Dulcinea, that she deal with him as shall be most pleasing to her." The terrified and disconsolate ladies, without discussing Don Quixote's demand, or asking who Dulcinea might be, promised that their squire should do all that had been commanded. "Then on the faith of that promise," said Don Quixote, "I shall do him no further harm, though he well deserves it of me." Chapter 10. Of the pleasant discourse that passed between Don Quixote and his squire Sancho Panza. Now by this time Sancho had risen, rather the worse for the handling of the friar's muleteers, and stood watching the battle of his master Don Quixote, and praying to God in his heart that it might be his will to grant him the victory, and that he might thereby win some island to make him governor of, as he had promised. Seeing therefore that the struggle was now over, and that his master was returning to Mount Rocinante, he approached to hold the stirrup for him, and before he could mount he went on his knees before him, and taking his hand kissed it, saying, "May it please your worship, Señor Don Quixote, to give me the government of that island which has been won in this hard fight, for be it ever so big, I feel myself in sufficient force to be able to govern it as much and as well as anyone in the world who has ever governed islands." To which Don Quixote replied, "Thou must take notice, brother Sancho, that this adventure, and those like it, are not adventures of islands, but of crossroads, in which nothing is got except a broken head or an ear the less. Have patience, for adventures will present themselves from which I may make you not only a governor, but something more." Sancho gave him many thanks, and again kissing his hand and the skirt of his hauberk, helped him to mount Rocinante, and mounting his ass himself, proceeded to follow his master, who at a brisk pace, without taking leave or saying anything further to the ladies belonging to the coach, turned into a wood that was hard by. Sancho followed him at his ass's best trot, but Rocinante stepped out, so that, seeing himself left behind, he was forced to call to his master to wait for him. Don Quixote did so, reining in Rocinante until his weary squire came up, who on reaching him said, "It seems to me, señor, it would be prudent in us to go and take refuge in some church, for seeing how mauled he with whom you fought has been left, it will be no wonder if they gave information of the affair to the Holy Brotherhood, and arrest us, and faith, if they do, before we come out of jail we shall have to sweat for it." "Peace," said Don Quixote. "Where hast thou ever seen or heard that a knight-errant has been arraigned before a court of justice, however many homicides he may have committed?" "I know nothing about homicides," answered Sancho, "nor in my life have had anything to do with one. I only know that the Holy Brotherhood looks after those who fight in the fields, and in that other matter I do not meddle." "Then thou needest have no uneasiness, my friend," said Don Quixote, "for I will deliver thee out of the hands of the Chaldeans, much more out of those of the Brotherhood. But tell me, as thou livest, hast thou seen a more valiant knight than I in all the known world? Hast thou read it in the history of any who has or had higher mettle in attack, more spirit in maintaining it, more dexterity in wounding, or skill in overthrowing?" "The truth is," said Sancho, "that I have never read any history, for I can neither read nor write. But what I will venture to bet is that a more daring master than your worship I have never served in all the days of my life, and God grant that this daring be not paid for where I have said, 'What I beg of your worship is to dress your wound, for a great deal of blood flows from that ear, and I have here some lint and a little white ointment in the alforjas.'" "All that might be well dispensed with," said Don Quixote, "if I had remembered to make a vial of the balsam of Fierabras, for time and medicine are saved by one single drop." "What vial and what balsam is that?" said Sancho Panza. "It is a balsam," answered Don Quixote, "the receipt of which I have in my memory, with which one need have no fear of death or dread dying of any wound, and so when I make it and give it to thee, thou hast nothing to do when in some battle thou seest they have cut me in half through the middle of the body, as is wont to happen frequently, but neatly and with great nicety, ere the blood congeal, to place that portion of the body which shall have fallen to the ground upon the other half which remains in the saddle, taking care to fit it on evenly and exactly. Then thou shalt give me to drink but 2 drops of the balsam I have mentioned, and thou shalt see me become sounder than an apple." "If that be so," said Panza, "I renounce henceforth the government of the promised island, and desire nothing more in payment of my many and faithful services than that your worship give me the receipt of this supreme liquor, for I am persuaded that it will be worth more than 2 reals an ounce anywhere, and I want no more to pass the rest of my life in ease and honour, but it remains to be told if it costs much to make it. With less than 3 reals, 6 quarts of it may be made, said Don Quixote. Sinner that I am, said Sancho, why does your worship put off making it and teaching it to me? Peace, friend, answered Don Quixote. Greater secrets I mean to teach thee, and greater favours to bestow upon thee, and for the present let us see to the dressing, for my ear pains me more than I could wish. Sancho took out some lint and ointment from the alforjas, but when Don Quixote came to see his helmet shattered, he was like to lose his senses, and clapping his hand upon his sword and raising his eyes to heaven, he said, I swear by the Creator of all things and the 4 Gospels in their fullest extent, to do as the great Marquis of Mantua did when he swore to avenge the death of his nephew Baldwin, and that was not to eat bread from a tablecloth, nor embrace his wife, and other points which, though I cannot now call them to mind, I here grant as expressed, until I take complete vengeance upon him who has committed such an offence against me. Hearing this, Sancho said to him, Your worship should bear in mind, Señor Don Quixote, that if the knight has done what was commanded him in going to present himself before my lady Dulcinea del Toboso, he will have done all that he was bound to do, and does not deserve further punishment until he commits some new offence. Thou hast said well and hit the point, answered Don Quixote, and so I recall the oath in so far as it relates to taking fresh vengeance on him, but I make and confirm it anew to lead the life I have said until such time as I take by force from some knight another helmet such as this and as good, and think not, Sancho, that I am raising smoke with straw in doing so, for I have one to imitate in this matter, since the very same thing to a hair happened in the case of Mambrino's helmet, which cost Sacripante so dear. Señor, replied Sancho, let your worship send all such oaths to the devil, for they are very pernicious to salvation and prejudicial to the conscience. Just tell me now, if for several days to come we fall in with no man armed with a helmet, what are we to do? Is the oath to be observed in spite of all the inconvenience and discomfort it will be to sleep in your clothes, and not to sleep in a house, and 1,000 other mortifications contained in the oath of that old fool the Marquis of Mantua, whom your worship is now wanting to revive? Let your worship observe that there are no men in armour travelling on any of these roads, nothing but carriers and carters, who do not only not wear helmets, but perhaps have never heard of them all their lives. Thou art wrong there, said Don Quixote, for we shall not have been above 2 hours among these cross-roads before we see more men in armour than came to Albraca to win the fair Angelica. Enough, said Sancho, so be it then, and God grant us success, and that the time for winning that island which is costing me so dear may soon come, and then let me die. I have already told thee, Sancho, said Don Quixote, not to give thyself any uneasiness on that score, for if an island should fail, there is the kingdom of Denmark, or of Sobradisa, which will fit thee as a ring fits the finger, and all the more that, being on terra firma, thou wilt all the better enjoy thyself. But let us leave that to its own time. See if thou hast anything for us to eat in those alforjas, because we must presently go in quest of some castle where we may lodge to-night, and make the balsam I told thee of, for I swear to thee by God, this ear is giving me great pain. I have here an onion, and a little cheese, and a few scraps of bread, said Sancho, but they are not victuals fit for a valiant knight like your worship. How little thou knowest about it, answered Don Quixote. I would have thee to know, Sancho, that it is the glory of knights-errant to go without eating for a month, and even when they do eat, that it should be of what first comes to hand, and this would have been clear to thee had thou read as many histories as I have, for though they are very many, among them all I have found no mention made of knights-errant eating, unless by accident or at some sumptuous banquets prepared for them, and the rest of the time they passed in dalliance. And though it is plain they could not do without eating and performing all the other natural functions, because in fact they were men like ourselves, it is plain too that, wandering as they did the most part of their lives through woods and wilds without a cook, their most usual fare would be rustic viands such as those thou now offer me, so that, friend Sancho, let not that distress thee which pleases me, and do not seek to make a new world, or pervert knight-errantry. Pardon me, your worship, said Sancho, for as I cannot read or write, as I said just now, I neither know nor comprehend the rules of the profession of chivalry. Henceforward I will stock the alforjas with every kind of dry fruit for your worship, as you are a knight. As for myself, as I am not one, I will furnish them with poultry, and other things more substantial. I do not say, Sancho, replied Don Quixote, that it is imperative on knights-errant not to eat anything else but the fruits thou speakest of, only that their more usual diet must be these, and certain herbs they found in the fields, which they knew, and I know too. A good thing it is, answered Sancho, to know these herbs, for to my thinking it will be needful some day to put that knowledge into practice. And here, taking out what he said he had brought, the pair made their repast peaceably and sociably. But anxious to find quarters for the night, they with all dispatch made an end of their poor dry fare, mounted at once, and made haste to reach some habitation before night set in. But daylight and the hope of succeeding in their object failed them close by the huts of some goatherds, so they determined to pass the night there, and it was as much to Sancho's discontent not to have reached a house, as it was to his master's satisfaction to sleep under the open heaven, for he fancied that each time this happened to him he performed an act of ownership that helped to prove his chivalry. Chapter 11. What befell Don Quixote with certain goatherds. He was cordially welcomed by the goatherds, and Sancho, having as best as he could put up Rocinante and the ass, drew toward the fragrance that came from some pieces of salted goat simmering in a pot on the fire, and though he would have liked at once to try if they were ready to be transferred from the pot to the stomach, he refrained from doing so as the goatherds removed them from the fire, and laying sheepskins on the ground, quickly spread their rude table, and with signs of hearty goodwill invited them both to share what they had. Round the skins 6 of the men belonging to the fold seated themselves, having first with rough politeness pressed Don Quixote to take a seat upon a trough, which they placed for him upside down. Don Quixote seated himself, and Sancho Panza remained standing to serve the cup, which was made of horn. Seeing him standing, his master said to him, "That thou mayest see, Sancho, the good that knight-errantry contains in itself, and how those who fill any office in it are on the high road to be speedily honoured and esteemed by the world, I desire that thou seat thyself here at my side, and in the company of these worthy people, and that thou be one with me who am thy master and natural lord, and that thou eat from my plate and drink from whatever I drink from, for the same may be said of knight-errantry as of love, that it levels all." "Great thanks," said Sancho. "But I may tell your worship that provided I have enough to eat, I can eat it as well or better standing, and by myself, than seated alongside an emperor. And indeed, if the truth is to be told, what I eat in my corner without form or fuss has much more relish for me, even though it be bread and onions, than the turkeys of those other tables where I am forced to chew slowly, drink little, wipe my mouth every minute, and cannot sneeze or cough if I want, or do other things that are the privileges of liberty and solitude. So, señor, as for those honours which your worship would put upon me as a servant and follower of knight-errantry, exchange them for other things which may be of more use and advantage to me. For these, though I fully acknowledge them as received, I renounce from this moment to the end of the world." "For all that," said Don Quixote, "thou must seat thyself, because him who humbleth himself God exalteth." And seizing him by the arm, he forced him to sit down beside himself. The goatherds did not understand this jargon about squires and knights-errant, and all they did was to eat in silence and stare at their guests, who with great elegance and appetite were stowing away pieces as big as one's fist. The course of meat finished, they spread upon the sheepskins a great heap of parched acorns, and with them they put down a half-cheese harder than if it had been made of mortar. All this while the horn was not idle, for it went round so constantly, now full, now empty, like the bucket of a water-wheel, that it soon drained one of the 2 wineskins that were in sight. When Don Quixote had quite appeased his appetite, he took up a handful of the acorns, and contemplating them attentively, delivered himself somewhat in this fashion: "Happy the age, happy the time, to which the ancients gave the name of golden, not because in that fortunate age the gold so coveted in this iron one was gained without toil, but because they that lived in it knew not the 2 words mine and thine. In that blessed age all things were in common. To win the daily food no labour was required of any, save to stretch forth his hand and gather it from the sturdy oaks that stood generously inviting him with their sweet ripe fruit. The clear streams and running brooks yielded their savoury limpid waters in noble abundance. The busy and sagacious bees fixed their republic in the clefts of the rocks and hollows of the trees, offering without usance the plenteous produce of their fragrant toil to every hand. The mighty cork trees, unenforced save of their own courtesy, shed the broad light bark that it served at first to roof the houses supported by rude stakes, a protection against the inclemency of heaven alone. Then all was peace, all friendship, all concord, as yet the dull share of the crooked plough had not yet dared to rend and pierce the tender bowels of our first mother, that without compulsion yielded from every portion of her broad fertile bosom all that could satisfy, sustain, and delight the children that then possessed her. Then it was that the innocent and fair young shepherdess roamed from vale to vale and hill to hill, with flowing locks, and no more garments than were needful modestly to cover what modesty seeks and ever sought to hide. Nor were there ornaments like those in use to-day, set off by Tyrian purple, and silk tortured in endless fashions, but the wreathed leaves of the green dock and ivy, wherewith they went as bravely and becomingly decked as our court dames, with all the rare and far-fetched artifices that idle curiosity has taught them. Then the love-thoughts of the heart clothed themselves simply and naturally as the heart conceived them, nor sought to commend themselves by forced and rambling verbiage. Fraud, deceit, or malice had then not yet mingled with truth and sincerity. Justice held her ground, undisturbed and unassailed by the efforts of favour and of interest, that now so much impair, pervert, and beset her. Arbitrary law had not yet established itself in the mind of the judge, for then there was no cause to judge, and no one to be judged. Maidens and modesty, as I have said, wandered at will alone and unattended, without fear of insult from lawlessness or libertine assault, and if they were undone, it was of their own will and pleasure. But now, in this hateful age of ours, no one is safe, not though some new labyrinth like that of Crete conceal and surround her. Even there the pestilence of gallantry will make its way to them through chinks or on the air by the zeal of its accursed importunity, and despite of all seclusion, lead them to ruin. In defence of these, as time advanced and wickedness increased, the order of knights-errant was instituted, to defend maidens, to protect widows, and to succour the orphans and the needy. To this order I belong, brother goatherds, to whom I return thanks for the hospitality, and kindly welcome ye offer me and my squire. For though by natural law all living are bound to show favour to knights-errant, yet seeing that without knowing this obligation you have welcomed and feasted me, it is right that with all the good will in my power I should thank you for yours. All this long harangue, which might very well have been spared, our knight delivered because the acorns they gave him reminded him of the golden age, and the whim seized him to address all this unnecessary argument to the goatherds, who listened to him gaping in amazement without saying a word in reply. Sancho likewise held his peace and ate acorns, and paid repeated visits to the second wineskin, which they had hung up on a cork-tree to keep the wine cool. Don Quixote was longer in talking than the supper in finishing, at the end of which one of the goatherds said, "That your worship, Señor Knight-errant, may say with more truth that we show you hospitality with ready good will, we will give you amusement and pleasure by making one of our comrades sing. He will be here before long, and he is a very intelligent youth and deep in love, and what is more, he can read and write and play on the rebec to perfection." The goatherd had hardly done speaking when the notes of the rebec reached their ears, and shortly after the player came up, a very good-looking young man of about 22. His comrades asked him if he had supped, and on his replying that he had, he who had already made the offer said to him, "In that case, Antonio, thou mayst as well do us the pleasure of singing a little, that the gentleman, our guest, may see that even in the mountains and woods there are musicians. We have told him of thy accomplishments, and we want thee to show them and prove that we say true. So as thou livest, pray sit down, and sing that ballad about thy love that thy uncle the prebendary made thee, and that was so much liked in the town." "With all my heart," said the young man, and without waiting for more pressing, he seated himself on the trunk of a felled oak, and tuning his rebec, presently began to sing these words. Antonio's Ballad. Thou dost love me well, Olalla. Well I know it, even though love's mute tongues, thine eyes, have never, by thy glances, told me so. For I know my love thou knowest, therefore thine to claim I dare. Once it ceases to be secret, love need never feel despair. True it is, Olalla, sometimes thou hast all too plainly shown that thy heart is brass in hardness, and thy snowy bosom stone. Yet for all that, in thy coyness and thy fickle fits between, hope is there, at least the border of her garment may be seen. Lures to faith are they, those glimpses, and to faith in thee I hold. Kindness cannot make it stronger, coldness cannot make it cold. If it be that love is gentle, in thy gentleness I see something holding out assurance to the hopes of winning thee. If it be that in devotion lies a power hearts to move, that which every day I show thee helpful to my suit should prove. Many a time thou must have noticed, if to notice thou dost care, how I go about on Monday, dressed in all my Sunday wear. Love's eyes love to look on brightness, love loves what is gaily dressed. Sunday, Monday, all I care is thou shouldst see me in my best. No account I make of dances, or of strains that please thee so, keeping thee awake from midnight till the cocks began to crow. Or of how I roundly swore it, that there's none so fair as thou. True it is, but as I said it, by the girls I'm hated now. For Teresa of the hillside at my praise of thee was sore, said, you think you love an angel, it's a monkey you adore. Caught by all her glittering trinkets, and her borrowed braids of hair, and a host of made-up beauties that would love himself ensnare. 'Twas a lie, and so I told her, and her cousin at the word gave me his defiance for it, and what followed thou hast heard. Mine is no high-flown affection, mine no passion par amours, as they call it. What I offer is an honest love, and pure. Cunning cords the holy church has, cords of softest silk they be. Put thy neck beneath the yoke, dear, mine will follow, thou wilt see. Else, and once for all I swear it, by a saint of most renown, if I ever quit the mountains, 'twill be in a friar's gown. Here the goatherd brought his song to an end, and though Don Quixote entreated him to sing more, Sancho had no mind that way, being more inclined for sleep than for listening to songs. So said he to his master, Your worship will do well to settle at once where you mean to pass the night, for the labour these good men are at all day does not allow them to spend the night in singing. I understand thee, Sancho, replied Don Quixote. I perceive clearly that those visits to the wine-skin demand compensation in sleep rather than in music. It's sweet to us all, blessed be God, said Sancho. I do not deny it, replied Don Quixote, but settle thyself while thou wilt. Those of my calling are more becomingly employed in watching than in sleeping. Still it would be as well if thou wert to dress this ear for me again, for it is giving me more pain than it need. Sancho did as he bade him, but one of the goatherds, seeing the wound, told him not to be uneasy, as he would apply a remedy with which it would soon be healed, and gathering some leaves of rosemary, of which there was a great quantity there, he chewed them and mixed them with a little salt, and applying them to the ear he secured them firmly with a bandage, assuring him that no other treatment would be required, and so it proved. Chapter 12. Of what a goatherd related to those with Don Quixote. Just then another young man, one of those who fetched their provisions from the village, came up and said, Do you know what is going on in the village, comrades? How could we know it? Replied one of them. Well, then you must know, continued the young man, this morning, that the famous student shepherd called Chrysostom died, and it is rumoured that he died of love for that devil of a village girl, the daughter of Guillermo the Rich, she that wanders about the wolds here in the dress of a shepherdess. Do you mean Marcella? Said one. Her I mean, answered the goatherd, and the best of it is, he has directed in his will that he is to be buried in the fields like a Moor, and at the foot of the rock where the cork-tree spring is, because, as the story goes, and they say he himself said so, that was the place where he first saw her, and he has also left other directions which the clergy of the village say should not and must not be obeyed, because they savour of paganism. To all which his great friend Ambrosio the student, he who like him also went about dressed as a shepherd, replies that everything must be done without any omission according to the directions left by Chrysostom, and about this the village is all in commotion. However, report says that after all, what Ambrosio and all the shepherds his friends desire will be done, and tomorrow they are coming to bury him with great ceremony where I said. I am sure it will be something worth seeing. At least I will not fail to go and see it, even if I know I should not return to the village tomorrow. We will do the same, answered the goatherds, and cast lots to see who must stay to mind the goats of all. Thou sayest well, Pedro, said one, though there will be no need of taking that trouble, for I will stay behind for all. And don't suppose it is virtue or want of curiosity in me. It is the splinter that ran into my foot the other day that will not let me walk. For all that we thank thee, answered Pedro. Don Quixote asked Pedro to tell him who the dead man was, and who the shepherdess, to which Pedro replied that all he knew was that the dead man was a wealthy gentleman belonging to a village in those mountains, who had been a student at Salamanca for many years, at the end of which he returned to his village with the reputation of being very learned and deeply read. Above all, they said, he was learned in the science of the stars, and of what went on yonder in the heavens and the sun and the moon, for he told us of the crise of the sun and the moon to the exact time. Eclipse, it is called, friend, not crisis, the darkening of those two luminaries, said Don Quixote, but Pedro, not troubling himself with trifles, went on with his story, saying, also he foretold when the year was going to be one of abundance or estility. Sterility, you mean, said Don Quixote. "Sterility or estility," answered Pedro, "it is all the same in the end. And I can tell you that by this his father and friends who believed him grew very rich because they did as he advised them, bidding them sow barley this year, not wheat. This year you may sow pulse and not barley, the next there will be a full oil crop, and the 3 following not a drop will be got." "That science is called astrology," said Don Quixote. "I do not know what it is called," replied Pedro, "but I know that he knew all this and more besides. But to make an end, not many months had passed after he returned from Salamanca, when one day he appeared dressed as a shepherd with his crook and sheepskin, having put off the long gown he wore as a scholar, and at the same time his great friend, Ambrosio by name, who had been his companion in his studies, took to the shepherd's dress with him. I forgot to say that Chrysostom, who is dead, was a great man for writing verses, so much so that he made carols for Christmas Eve, and plays for Corpus Christi, which the young men of our village acted, and all said they were excellent. When the villagers saw the 2 scholars so unexpectedly appearing in shepherd's dress, they were lost in wonder, and could not guess what had led them to make so extraordinary a change. About this time the father of our Chrysostom died, and he was left heir to a large amount of property in chattels as well as in land, no small number of cattle and sheep, and a large sum of money, of all of which the young man was left dissolute owner, and indeed he was deserving of it all, for he was a very good comrade, and kind-hearted, and a friend of worthy folk, and had a countenance like a benediction. Presently it came to be known that he had changed his dress with no other object than to wander about these wastes after that shepherdess Marcella our lad mentioned a while ago, with whom the deceased Chrysostom had fallen in love. And I must tell you now, for it is well you should know it, who this girl is. Perhaps, and even without any perhaps, you will not have heard anything like it in all the days of your life, though you should live more days than Sarna. "Se sara," said Don Quixote, unable to endure the goatherd's confusion of words. "The Sarna lives long enough," answered Pedro, "and if, señor, you must go finding fault with words at every step, we shall not make an end of it this 12-month. "Pardon me, friend," said Don Quixote, "but as there is such a difference between Sarna and Sara, I told you of it. However, you have answered very rightly, for Sarna lives longer than Sara, so continue your story, and I will not object any more to anything." "I will say then, my dear sir," said the goatherd, "that in our village there was a farmer even richer than the father of Chrysostom, who was named Guillermo, and upon whom God bestowed, over and above great wealth, a daughter, at whose birth her mother died, the most respected woman there was in this neighbourhood. I fancy I can see her now with that countenance which had the sun on one side and the moon on the other, and moreover active, and kind to the poor, for which I trust that at the present moment her soul is in bliss with God in the other world. Her husband Guillermo died of grief at the death of so good a wife, leaving his daughter Marcella, a child and rich, to the care of an uncle of hers, a priest and prebendary in our village. The girl grew up with such beauty that it reminded us of her mother's, which was very great, and yet it was thought that the daughter would exceed it, and so when she reached the age of 14 to 15 years old, nobody beheld her but blessed God that he had made her so beautiful, and the greater number were in love with her past redemption. Her uncle kept her in great seclusion and retirement, but for all that the fame of her great beauty spread, so that, as well for it as for her great wealth, her uncle was asked, solicited, and importuned to give her in marriage, not only by those of our town, but of those many leagues round, and by the persons of highest quality in them. But he, being a good Christian man, though he desired to give her in marriage at once, seeing her to be old enough, was unwilling to do so without her consent. Not that he had any eye to the gain and profit which the custody of the girl's property brought him while he put off her marriage, and faith, this was said in praise of the good priest in more than one set in town. For I would have you know, Sir Errant, that in these little villages everything is talked about, and everything is carped at, and rest assured, as I am, that the priest must be over and above good who forces his parishioners to speak well of him, especially in villages." "That is the truth," said Don Quixote, "but go on, for the story is very good, and you, good Pedro, tell it with very good grace." "May that of the Lord not be wanting to me," said Pedro, "that is the one to have. To proceed, you must know that though the uncle put before his niece and described to her the qualities of each one in particular of the many who had asked her in marriage, begging her to marry and to make a choice according to her own taste, she never gave any other answer than that she had no desire to marry just yet, and that being so young she did not think herself fit to bear the burden of matrimony. At these, to all appearance, reasonable excuses that she made, her uncle ceased to urge her, and waited till she was somewhat more advanced in age, and could mate herself to her own liking. For, said he, and he said quite right, parents are not to settle children in life against their will. But when one least looked for it, lo and behold, one day the demure Marcella makes her appearance turned shepherdess, and in spite of her uncle and all those of the town that strove to dissuade her, took to going afield with the other shepherd lasses of the village, and tending her own flock. And so, since she appeared in public, and her beauty came to be seen openly, I could not well tell you how many rich youths, gentlemen, and peasants have adopted the costume of Chrysostom, and go about these fields making love to her. One of these, as has already been said, was our deceased friend, of whom they say that he did not love but adore her. But you must not suppose, because Marcella chose a life of such liberty and independence, and of so little or rather no retirement, that she has given any occasion, or even the semblance of one, for disparagement of her purity and modesty. On the contrary, such and so great is the vigilance with which she watches over her honour, that all of those who court and woo her not one has boasted, or can with truth boast, that she has given him any hope, however small, of obtaining his desire. For although she does not avoid or shun the society and conversation of the shepherds, and treats them courteously and kindly, should any one of them come to declare his intention to her, though it be one as proper and holy as that of matrimony, she flings him from her like a catapult. And with this kind of disposition she does more harm in this country than if the plague had gotten into it, for her affability and her beauty draw on the hearts of those that associate with her to love and court her, but her scorn and her frankness bring them to the brink of despair, and so they know not what to say save to proclaim her aloud cruel and hard-hearted, and other names of the same sort, which well describe the nature of her character. And if you should remain here any time, señor, you would hear these hills and valleys resounding with the laments of the rejected ones who pursue her. Not far from this there is a spot where there are a couple of dozen tall beeches, and there is not one of them but has carved and written on its smooth bark the name of Marcella, and above some a crown carved on the same tree, as though her lover would say more plainly that Marcella wore and deserved that of all human beauty. Here one shepherd is sighing, there another is lamenting, there love songs are heard, here despairing elegies. One will pass all the hours of the night seated at the front of some oak or rock, and there, without having closed his weeping eyes, the sun finds him in the morning, bemused and bereft of senses, and another, without relief or respite to his sighs, stretched on the burning sand in the full heat of the sultry summer noontide, makes his appeal to the compassionate heavens, and over one and the other, over these and all, the beautiful Marcella triumphs free and careless. And all of us that know her are waiting to see what her pride will come to, and who is to be the happy man that will succeed in taming a nature so formidable, and gaining possession of a beauty so supreme. All that I have told you being such well-established truth, I am persuaded that what they say of the cause of Chrysostom's death, as our lad told us, is the same. And so I advise you, señor, fail not to be present at his burial, which will be well worth seeing, for Chrysostom had many friends, and it is not half a league from this place to where he directed he should be buried. I will make a point of it, said Don Quixote, and I thank you for the pleasure you have given me by relating so interesting a tale. Oh, said the goatherd, I do not even know the half of what has happened to the lovers of Marcella, but perhaps tomorrow we may fall in with some shepherd on the road who can tell us, and now it will be well for you to go and sleep under cover, for the night air may hurt your wound, though with the remedy I have applied to you there is no fear of an untoward result. Sancho Panza, who was wishing the goatherd's loquacity at the devil, on his part begged his master to go into Pedro's hut to sleep. He did so, and passed all the rest of the night in thinking of his lady Dulcinea, in imitation of the lovers of Marcella. Sancho Panza settled himself between Rocinante and his ass, and slept, not like a lover who had been discarded, but like a man who had been soundly kicked. Chapter 13, in which is ended the story of the shepherdess Marcella, with other incidents. But hardly had day begun to show itself through the balconies of the east, when 5 of the 6 goatherds came to rouse Don Quixote, and tell him that if he was still of a mind to go and see the famous burial of Chrysostom, they would bear him company. Don Quixote, who desired nothing better, rose and ordered Sancho to saddle and pannel at once, which he did with all despatch, and with the same they all set out forthwith. They had not gone a quarter of a league when at the meeting of 2 paths they saw coming towards them some 6 shepherds dressed in black sheepskins, and with their heads crowned with garlands of cypress and bitter oleander. Each of them carried a stout holly staff in his hand, and along with them there came 2 men of quality on horseback in handsome travelling dress, with 3 servants on foot accompanying them. courteous salutations were exchanged on meeting, and inquiring one of the other which way each party was going, they learned that all were bound for the scene of the burial, so they all went on together. One of those on horseback addressing his companion said to him, "It seems to me, Signor Vivaldo, that we may reckon as well spent the delay we shall incur in seeing this remarkable funeral. For remarkable it cannot but be, judging by the strange things these shepherds have told us, of both the dead shepherd and the homicide shepherdess." "So I think too," replied Vivaldo, "and I would delay not to say a day, but 4, for the sake of seeing it." Don Quixote asked them what it was they had heard of Marcella and Chrysostom. The traveller answered that the same morning they had met these shepherds, and seen them dressed in this mournful fashion, they had asked them the reason of their appearing in such a guise, which one of them gave, describing the strange behaviour and beauty of a shepherdess called Marcella, and the loves of many who courted her, together with the death of that Chrysostom to whose burial they were going. In short, he repeated all that Pedro had related to Don Quixote. This conversation dropped, and another was commenced by him who was called Vivaldo, asking Don Quixote what was the reason that led him to go armed in that fashion in a country so peaceful. To which Don Quixote replied, "The pursuit of my calling does not allow or permit me to go in any other fashion. Easy life, enjoyment, and repose were invented for soft courtiers, but toil, unrest, and arms were invented and made for those alone whom the world calls knight-errant, of whom I, though unworthy, am the least of all." The instant they heard this, all set him down as mad, and the better to settle the point and discover what kind of madness his was, Vivaldo proceeded to ask him what knights-errant meant. "Have not your worships," replied Don Quixote, "read the annals and histories of England, in which are recorded the famous deeds of King Arthur, whom we, in our proper Castilian, invariably call King Artus, with regard to whom it is an ancient tradition, and commonly received all over that kingdom of Great Britain, that this king did not die, but was changed by magic art into a raven, and that in process of time he is to return to reign and recover his kingdom and sceptre, for which reason it cannot be proved that from that time to this any Englishman ever killed a raven? Well then, in the time of this good king, that famous order of chivalry of the Knights of the Round Table was instituted, and the amour of Don Lancelot of the Lake with the Queen Guinevere occurred, precisely as there is related, the go-between and confidant therein being the highly honourable Dame Quintanona, whence came that ballad so well known and widely spread in our Spain, "O never surely was there knight so served by hand of dame, as served was he Sir Lancelot hight when he from Britain came," with all the sweet and delectable course of his achievements in love and war. Handed down from that time, then, this order of chivalry went on extending and spreading itself over many and various parts of the world, and in it, famous and renowned for their deeds, were the mighty Amadis of Gaul with all his sons and descendants to the 5th generation, and the valiant Felixmarte of Hircania, and the never sufficiently praised Tirante el Blanco, and in our own days almost, we have seen and heard and talked with the invincible knight Don Belianis of Greece. This, then, sirs, is to be a knight-errant, and what I have spoken of is the order of his chivalry, of which, as I have already said, I, though a sinner, have made profession, and what the aforesaid knights professed, that same I do profess, and so I go through these solitudes and wilds, seeking adventures, resolved in soul to oppose my arm and person to the most perilous that fortune may offer me, in aid of the weak and needy." By these words of his, the travellers were able to satisfy themselves of Don Quixote's being out of his senses, and of the form of madness that overmastered him, at which they felt the same astonishment that all felt on first becoming acquainted with it; and Vivaldo, who was a person of great shrewdness and of a lively temperament, in order to beguile the short journey which they said was required to reach the mountain, the scene of the burial, sought to give him an opportunity of going on with his absurdities. So he said to him, "It seems to me, Signor Knight-errant, that your worship has made choice of one of the most austere professions in the world, and I imagine even that of the Carthusian monks is not so austere." "As austere it may perhaps be," replied our Don Quixote, "but so necessary for the world I am very much inclined to doubt. For if the truth is to be told, the soldier who executes what his captain orders does no less than the captain himself who gives the order. My meaning is, that churchmen, in peace and quiet, pray to heaven for the welfare of the world, but we soldiers and knights carry into effect what they pray for, defending it with the might of our arms and the edge of our swords, not under shelter, but in the open air, a target for the intolerable rays of the sun in summer and the piercing frosts of winter. Thus are we God's ministers on earth, and the arms by which his justice is done therein. and as the business of war and all that relates and belongs to it cannot be conducted without exceeding great sweat, toil, and exertion, it follows that those who make it their profession have undoubtedly more labour than those who in tranquil peace and quiet are engaged in praying to God to help the weak. I do not mean to say, nor does it enter into my thoughts, that the knights-errant calling is as good as that of the monk in his cell. I would merely infer from what I endure myself that it is beyond a doubt a more laborious and a more belaboured one, a hungrier and thirstier, a wretcheder, raggeder, and lousier. For there is no reason to doubt that the knights-errant of yore endured much hardship in the course of their lives, and if some of them, by the might of their arms, did rise to be emperors, in faith it cost them dear in the matter of blood and sweat, and if those who attained to that rank had not had magicians and sages to help them, they would have been completely balked in their ambition, and disappointed in their hopes. That is my own opinion, replied the traveller, but one thing among many others seems to me very wrong in knights-errant, and that is, that when they find themselves about to engage in some mighty and perilous adventure in which there is manifest danger of losing their lives, they never, at the moment of engaging in it, think of commending themselves to God, as is the duty of every good Christian in like peril, instead of which they commend themselves to their ladies with as much devotion as if they were their gods, a thing which seems to me to savour somewhat of heathenism. Sir, answered Don Quixote, that cannot on any account be admitted, and the knight-errant would be disgraced who acted otherwise, for it is usual and customary in knight-errantry that the knight-errant, who on engaging in any great feat of arms has his lady before him, should turn his eyes toward her softly and lovingly, as though with them entreating her to favour and protect him in the hazardous venture he is about to undertake, and even though no one hear him, he is bound to say certain words between his teeth, commending himself to her with all his heart, and of this we have innumerable instances in the histories, nor is it to be supposed from this that they are to omit commending themselves to God, for there will be time and opportunity for doing so while they are engaged in their task. For all that, answered the traveller, I feel some doubt still, because often I have read how words will arise between two knights-errant, and from one thing to another it comes about that their anger kindles, and they wheel their horses round, and take a good stretch of field, and then, without any more ado, at the top of their speed, they come to the charge, and in mid-career they are wont to commend themselves to their ladies, and what commonly comes of the encounter is that one falls over the haunches of his horse, pierced through and through by his antagonist's lance, and for the other, it is only by holding on to the mane of his horse that he can help falling to the ground. But I know not how the dead man had time to commend himself to God in the course of such rapid work as this. It would have been better if those words which he spent in commending himself to his lady, in the midst of his career, had been devoted to his duty and obligation as a Christian. Moreover, it is my belief that all knights-errant have not ladies to commend themselves to, for they are not all in love. That is impossible, said Don Quixote. I say it is impossible that there could be a knight-errant without a lady, because to such it is as natural and proper to be in love as to the heavens to have stars. Most certainly no history has been seen in which there is to be found a knight-errant without an amour, and for the simple reason that without one he would be held no legitimate knight but a bastard, and one who had gained entrance into the stronghold of the said knighthood, not by the door, but over the wall like a thief and a robber. Nevertheless, said the traveller, if I remember rightly, I think I have read that Don Galaor, the brother of the valiant Amadis of Gaul, never had any special lady to whom he might commend himself, and yet he was not the less esteemed, and was a very stout and famous knight. To which our Don Quixote made answer, Sir, one solitary swallow does not make summer. Moreover, I know that knight was in secret very deeply in love. Besides which, that way of falling in love with all that took his fancy was a natural propensity which he could not control. But in short, it is very manifest that he had one alone whom he made mistress of his will, to whom he commended himself very frequently and very secretly, for he prided himself on being a reticent knight. Then if it be essential that every knight-errant should be in love, said the traveller, it may be fairly supposed that your worship is so, as you are of the order, and if you do not pride yourself on being as reticent as Don Galaor, I entreat you as earnestly as I can, in the name of all this company and in my own, to inform us of the name, country, rank, and beauty of your lady, for she will esteem herself fortunate if all the world knows that she is loved and served by such a knight as your worship seems to be. At this, Don Quixote heaved a deep sigh, and said, I cannot say positively whether my sweet enemy is pleased or not that the world should know I serve her. I can only say, in answer to what has been so courteously asked of me, that her name is Dulcinea, her country El Toboso, a village of La Mancha. Her rank must be at least that of a princess, since she is my queen and lady, and her beauty superhuman, since all the impossible and fanciful attributes of beauty which the poets apply to their ladies are verified in her. For her hairs are gold, her forehead Elysian fields, her eyebrows rainbows, her eyes suns, her cheeks roses, her lips coral, her teeth pearls, her neck alabaster, her bosom marble, her hands ivory, her fairness snow, and what modesty conceals from sight, such I think and imagine, as rational reflection can only extol, not compare. We should like to know her lineage, race, and ancestry, said Vivaldo. To which Don Quixote replied, She is not of the ancient Roman Curtii, Cai or Scipios, nor of the modern Colonnas or Orsini, nor the Moncadas or Risqueñas of Catalonia, nor yet of the Rebellas or Villanovas of Valencia, Palafoxes, Nusas, Rocabertis, Corellas, Lunas, Alagones, Oreas, Foces, or Goreas of Aragon, Cerdas, Manriques, Mendozas, or Guzmans of Castile, Alencastros, Palas, or Manceses of Portugal. But she is of those of El Toboso of La Mancha, a lineage that, though modern, may furnish a source of gentle blood for the most illustrious families of the ages that are to come, and let none dispute with me save on the condition that Zerbino placed at the foot of the trophy of Orlando's arms, saying, These let none move who dareth not his might with Roland prove. Although mine is of the Cachopins of Laredo, said the traveller, I will not venture to compare it with that of El Toboso of La Mancha, though to tell the truth no such surname has until now ever reached my ears. What? Said Don Quixote. Has that never reached them? The rest of the party went along listening with great attention to the conversation of the pair, and even the very goatherds and shepherds perceived how exceedingly out of his wits our Don Quixote was. Sancho Panza alone thought that what his master said was the truth, knowing who he was and having known him from his birth, and all that he felt any difficulty in believing was that about the fair Dulcinea del Toboso, because neither any such name nor any such princess had ever come to his knowledge, though he lived so close to El Toboso. They were going along conversing in this way, when they saw descending a gap between two high mountains some 20 shepherds, all clad in sheepskins of black wool, and crowned with garlands which, as afterwards appeared, were some of them of yew, some of cypress. 6 of the number were carrying a bier covered with a great variety of flowers and branches, on seeing which one of the goatherds said, Those who come there are the bearers of Chrysostom's body, and the foot of that mountain is the place where he ordered them to bury him. They therefore made haste to reach the spot, and did so by the time those who came had laid the bier upon the ground, and 4 of them, with sharp pickaxes, were digging a grave by the side of a hard rock. They greeted each other courteously, and then Don Quixote and those who accompanied him turned to examine the bier, and on it, covered with flowers, they saw a dead body in the dress of a shepherd, to all appearance of one 30 years of age, and showing even in death that in life he had been of comely features and gallant bearing. Around him, on the bier itself, were laid some books, and several papers opened and folded, and those who were looking on, as well as those who were opening the grave, and all the others who were there, preserved a strange silence, until one of those who had borne the body said to another, Observe carefully, Ambrosia, if this is the place Chrysostom spoke of, since you are anxious that what he directed in his will should be so strictly complied with. This is the place, answered Ambrosia, for in it many a time did my poor friend tell me the story of his hard fortune. Here it was, he told me, that for the first time he saw the mortal enemy of the human race, and here too, for the first time, he declared to her his passion, as honourable as it was devoted, and here it was that at last Marcella ended by scorning and rejecting him, so as to bring the tragedy of his wretched life to a close. Here, in memory of misfortune so great, he desired to be laid in the bowels of eternal oblivion. Then, turning to Don Quixote and the travellers, he went on to say, That body, sirs, on which you are looking with compassionate eyes, was the abode of a soul on which heaven bestowed a vast share of its riches. That is the body of Chrysostom, who was unrivalled in wit, unequalled in courtesy, unapproached in gentle bearing, a phoenix in friendship, generous without limit, grave without arrogance, gay without vulgarity, and, in short, first in all that constitutes goodness and second to none in all that makes up misfortune. He loved deeply, he was hated, he adored, he was scorned. He wooed a wild beast, he pleaded with marble, he pursued the wind, he cried to the wilderness, he served in gratitude, and for reward was made the prey of death in the mid-course of life, cut short by a shepherdess whom he sought to immortalize in the memory of man, as these papers which you see could fully prove, had he not commanded me to consign them to the fire after having consigned his body to the earth. "You would deal with them more harshly and cruelly than their owner himself," said Vivaldo, "for it is neither right nor proper to do the will of one who enjoins what is wholly unreasonable. It would not have been reasonable in Augustus Caesar had he permitted the directions left by the divine Mantuan in his will to be carried into effect. So that, Signor Ambrosio, while you consign your friend's body to the earth, you should not consign his writings to oblivion. For if he gave the order in bitterness of heart, it is not right that you should irrationally obey it. On the contrary, by granting life to these papers, let the cruelty of Marcella live forever, to serve as a warning in ages to come to all men who shun and avoid falling into like a danger. Or I and all of us who have come here know already the story of this your love-stricken and heart-broken friend, and we know too your friendship, and the cause of his death, and the directions he gave at the close of his life, from which sad story may be gathered how great was the cruelty of Marcella, the love of Chrysostom, and the loyalty of your friendship, together with the end awaiting those who pursue rashly the path that insane passion opens to their eyes. Last night we learned of the death of Chrysostom, and that he was to be buried here, and out of curiosity and pity we left our direct road, and resolved to come and see with our eyes that which when heard of had so moved our compassion, and in consideration of that compassion, and our desire to prove it, if we might, by condolence, we beg of you, excellent Ambrosia, or at least I on my own account entreat you, that instead of burning these papers you allow me to carry away some of them." And without waiting for the shepherd's answer, he stretched out his hand, and took up some of those that were nearest to him, seeing which Ambrosio said, "Out of courtesy, Signor, I will grant your request as to those you have taken, but it is idle to expect me to abstain from burning the remainder." Vivaldo, who was eager to see what the papers contained, opened one of them at once, and saw that its title was Lay of Despair. Ambrosio, hearing it, said, "That is the last paper the unhappy man wrote, and that you may see, Signor, to what an end his misfortunes brought him. Read it so that you may be heard, for you will have time enough for that while we are waiting for the grave to be dug." "I will do so very willingly," said Vivaldo, and as all the bystanders were equally eager they gathered around him, and he, reading in a loud voice, found that it ran as follows. End of Part 4.